So we've got another major development in the nationwide legal fight challenging the current structure of the NFA after the $0 tax changes. And this update is important because the court has now officially allowed the plaintiffs to introduce new Fifth Circuit authority attacking the constitutional foundation of the NFA. And if this reasoning gains traction, this doesn't just weaken portions of the NFA, it could undo the entire constitutional framework. So let's break down what just happened in this critical case. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. You can also hit the like button that just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. I also want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is Attorneys on Retainer. When it comes to self-defense protection, in my opinion, AOR is in a league of their own. They're backed by an actual law firm, the Attorneys for Freedom, and they're always trying to expand upon their benefits to give you as much as possible as a member. So if you're interested, you can check them out using the links down below. And if you sign up right now and you use my code ARMEDSCHOLAR, you can get $50 off of your individual sign-up fee or $25 off of the family fee. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, this case is part of kind of the broader wave of challenges that followed Congress's actions where they reduced the NFA tax to $0. So they took it from $200 all the way to $0 for certain items like short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, suppressors, and AOWs. Now, historically, the NFA survived constitutional scrutiny because it was framed as an actual tax. That was always the foundation of the NFA. The Supreme Court actually upheld the law under Congress's taxing authority as well. But now the plaintiffs argue that once the tax effectively became $0 now, the law stopped functioning like a real tax altogether. What now remains is simply a regulatory system involving registration requirements, fingerprinting, approval, and criminal penalties, but without the constitutional tax justification that originally was used to uphold this law. Now, right now, both sides are trying to win this case and they're filing cross motions for summary judgment. The DOJ is still arguing that the NFA survives and remains constitutional, and the plaintiffs argue that the current structure has lost its actual constitutional foundation because of the $0 tax, and therefore it should be struck down. And recently, the plaintiffs have made aggressive, arguments, and they've been trying to aggressively strengthen those arguments, and they've introduced new authority, including a new case out of the Fifth Circuit. Now, here's the major update of what is now developed in this case. The Fifth Circuit here has officially granted the plaintiffs permission to file their supplemental authority, and so they've allowed that new case to enter into this challenge. That includes this new Fifth Circuit authority that we've discussed previously, and this matters because the court is now formally allowing those arguments into the record as part of this challenge against the NFA. On top of that, the DOJ has also now been given until May 20th to respond to these new Fifth Circuit, decision and arguments and the supplemental, information that has been allowed into this case. So this fight over whether the NFA still survives under Congress's taxing powers is now fully before the court, and it's moving forward in a very aggressive way. The supplemental authority that the plaintiffs introduced centers around a recent Fifth Circuit case called McNutt versus the DOJ. And this is significant because this is not just another district court opinion or persuasive, from a different circuit court. This is binding Fifth Circuit precedent on a federal court. It's binding here on this district court that sits within the Fifth Circuit's jurisdiction. It's coming directly from the Fifth Circuit, and it deals with a very similar issue and similar arguments that are now at play in this NFA case. In that McNutt case, the Fifth Circuit looked at the federal prohibition involving home alcohol distilling. The government attempted to justify that law under Congress's taxing powers, which is very similar to the historical justification that they're trying to now use for the NFA itself. But in that case, the Fifth Circuit rejected that argument. The court essentially said that if a law is not actually producing revenue, it cannot genuinely function as a tax. And if it is not functioning as a tax, then the necessary and proper clause cannot simply be used to save it. And that language is now becoming central to the plaintiff's attack against the NFA in this case. The plaintiffs are now taking that reasoning and applying it directly to the NFA structure. Their argument is actually pretty straightforward. The NFA survived historically because it was treated as a tax statute. But if the tax is now effectively $0 for these types of items, then the law is no longer operating as a true tax system. And according to this new Fifth Circuit authority, that creates a constitutional problem because the essential feature of a tax is that it generates actual revenue. If it no longer does that, then the constitutional justification supporting the law begins to weaken dramatically, and it just looks like a pure regulatory scheme. The plaintiffs also point to another major issue that was raised by the Fifth Circuit in that ruling. The court warned that if the government's theory were accepted, Congress could regulate virtually anything simply by loosely trying to tie it to taxation. The Fifth Circuit rejected that idea and explained that there has to be some constitutional limiting principles, and you can't just say taxing clause or taxing powers anytime you need something to be constitutional. Now, bringing that back to this NFA case, the plaintiffs are arguing that if the federal government can require registration, fingerprints, approvals, and criminal penalties all tied to a tax that no longer meaningfully exists or collects any revenue, then there is effectively no constitutional limit to the federal power. And that is exactly the type of concerns that the Fifth Circuit warned about and ruled against in that recent decision. The plaintiffs are also using the new authority to go after another fallback argument from the DOJ, which is the Commerce Clause. The Fifth Circuit emphasized that courts cannot simply invent a new constitutional basis for a law after the fact or after the taxing power kind of falls through. Instead, courts have to look at the actual constitutional power that the law was originally grounded on and passed on. And the plaintiffs argue that the NFA has historically been justified as a tax statute, not as any Commerce Clause regulation. So according to the plaintiffs, the DOJ cannot now pivot to a completely different constitutional theory simply because the original tax rationale has now been weakened. Now, procedurally, this order matters for a very important reason. The court did not reject those supplemental arguments. In fact, they recognized them and they're allowing them into the record. The court did not strike the authority from the record. Instead, they're accepting it and giving the DOJ an opportunity to now respond to that new precedent. That tells us that the court considers these arguments significant and binding enough to fully litigate and be included into this case. And that is a major development because, again, that's binding Fifth Circuit precedent on a very similar issue. So stepping back, this case is clearly escalating. Before, the plaintiffs were simply arguing that the NFA no longer functions like a real tax. Now they have binding Fifth Circuit authority supporting that type of framework. So this challenge is becoming much more serious because the actual constitutional foundation of the NFA, the taxing power itself, is now being directly tested by this federal court. So that's the latest order in this major, NFA case after the $0 tax change. That is the development now in this Silencer Shop case. The court has now formally allowed the plaintiffs to bring in that new Fifth Circuit authority, directly attacking the constitutional foundation of the NFA. And now the DOJ will have to respond to those arguments, and they will have to respond to those head on and argue why that case should not actually be persuasive with the NFA challenge and maybe why it doesn't matter. So this fight is no longer just theoretical. This is one of the core constitutional arguments that's now going to play out with this NFA challenge. So that's the latest update in this nationwide NFA challenge after the $0 tax change. As soon as the DOJ responds or the court moves more on this issue, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by liking, commenting, and subscribing. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.